Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're taking a trip to Auckland to uncover the origins of the suburb Takanini. It's a name that most Kiwis are probably familiar with, but I bet you don't know the full story of how it came to be.
It's a really interesting case, actually. Takanini is more than just a suburb. It's a name that's deeply intertwined with New Zealand's history, politics, and cultural identity.
Right, and we've got some great source material to dig into today. Newspaper articles, historical records, even some strong opinions from locals. We'll try to piece it all together.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's start with the basics. Where does the name Takanini even come from?
Well, it's named after a guy called Ihaka Takanini, who was a pretty prominent Maori chief back in the 19th century. He actually owned a massive chunk of land right where the suburb is now.
I saw a photo of Ihaka from 1856 in the Hawken collections, and wow, what a presence. He looks like a real leader.
Oh yeah, definitely. He was a powerful figure in his time, but his story is also pretty complicated. He started out as a crown officer.
So he was on the side of the colonial government.
Yeah, exactly. But then during the land wars in 1863, he decided to join the Waikato Nation.
He switched sides. Why would he do that?
Well, it was a turbulent time, and there were a lot of factors at play. Land ownership was a huge point of contention, and Ihaka probably felt a stronger allegiance to his people than to the crown in the end.
That's a big decision, especially during a war. I can't imagine what that must have been like.
No, absolutely. It was a defining moment, not just for Ihaka, but for the history of the area.
And what happened to his land after he joined the Waikato Nation?
Well, the New Zealand government had passed this law called the New Zealand Settlements Act in 1863. It basically allowed them to confiscate land from anyone they considered to be rebels.
So they took Ihaka's land because he sided with the Waikato.
Basically, yeah. But in Ihaka's case, there's evidence that his family received some financial compensation for the land.
So it wasn't a total loss, I guess. But still, losing your land must have been devastating.
For sure. But Ihaka's story doesn't end there. It actually continues through his son, Wilson Takanini.
Wilson Takanini, huh? Interesting that his name is spelled with two A's.
It is, isn't it? And that actually becomes a big part of the story later on. Anyway, in 1885, Wilson played a crucial role in subdividing his father's former land.
Okay, so the land started being divided up. Is that how the suburb itself began to take shape?
You could say that. That was kind of the first step towards what we know as Takanini today. And interestingly, Wilson's name is also connected to the Auckland locality of Wiri.
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah, history is full of these connections. But going back to Takanini, the official date for its establishment as a suburb is actually March 13, 1914.
So that's when it really became like a place on the map.
Exactly. That's when it went through another big subdivision and became what we recognize as the suburb of Takanini today.
Wow, that's over a century ago. But now there's this whole debate about changing the spelling of Takanini, right, to Takanini with two A's.
Yep, that's right. It might seem like a small change, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
So it's not just a typo. There's an actual reason behind it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The argument is that Takanini, with the two A's, is a compound word in Maori, meaning something like giddy or whirling.
So it's about preserving the original Maori meaning and pronunciation.
Exactly. Organizations like the Geographic Board are really pushing for this change, saying that the single A spelling is a historical inaccuracy that needs to be fixed.
Makes sense. And it's not just talk. I read somewhere that Auckland Transport already installed signs with the two AS spelling at the train station back in 2018.
They did, yeah. It seems like they're already trying to get people used to the new spelling.
So it's not just some theoretical idea. It's actually happening. But I'm guessing not everyone's on board with this change.
You're right about that. There's definitely some pushback, and we'll delve into the reasons why in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, this is getting interesting. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after a quick break.
The champion of the moment comes home. Rising fast, winner of the 1954 Melbourne Cup, returns to his home paddocks at Takanini. His trainer, Mr. Ivan Tucker, and Mrs. Tucker greet the champion at the front gate with his usual delicacy, an apple a day.
All right, so we've got this push for what some people are calling the historically accurate spelling of Takanini, But like you said, there's some pushback against this.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing here is that the whole idea of historical accuracy is actually being challenged.
How so?
Well, one of the sources we looked at makes this argument that before Christian missionaries arrived in the 1820s, the Maori language didn't really have a written form.
Huh. Okay, so no writing system.
Exactly, and if there was no written language, how can you say that one spelling is more correct than another?
Yeah, that's a good point. If it wasn't written down, then how do we even know what the original spelling was?
Right. It throws a wrench into the whole debate. And to make things even more complicated, this source points out that even the Takanini family themselves used both spellings.
Wait, really? So sometimes they use one A, sometimes two.
Yep, that's what it seems like. Even within the family, there wasn't this strict adherence to one specific spelling.
So this idea that there's only one correct spelling, it might not be the whole story.
I think that's a key takeaway here. And this leads to another argument against the name change, which is that it's seen as a form of political interference.
Political interference, what do you mean by that?
Well, some people feel that these name changes are driven more by ideology and political agendas than a genuine desire for historical accuracy.
So it's less about honoring the past and more about pushing a particular narrative.
That's the concern some people have.
Yeah.
They see these name changes as an attempt to rewrite history or impose a certain view of culture on everyone.
So if the historical argument is shaky and there's this sense of political maneuvering, it makes you wonder what the real motivations are.
It's definitely a question worth asking. And this debate goes beyond just Takanini. It reflects a tension we're seeing in a lot of places, this struggle over who gets to control the narrative of history and how that shapes our understanding of cultural identity.
Right, because ultimately, these are stories about people, about real communities. And for the people who actually live in Takanini, it's not just some abstract debate, right? These changes have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. One of the sources we looked at brings up some very practical concerns that people have. Things like having to change their address on all their official documents, dealing with courier services, updating signage. It's a hassle.
Yeah, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be. And then there's also the potential for creating these generational divides. Think about it. Older generations who always known the suburb as Takanini, they might not want to adapt to the new spelling.
They might feel like something's being taken away from them.
Exactly. And you end up with different groups of people using different names for the same place. It can lead to confusion, even resentment.
So instead of unifying people around a shared history, these changes could actually drive them further apart.
That's a real worry for some people. They see this push for name changes as part of a broader cultural shift that they feel alienated from, and this is just one example of it.
So it really boils down to this question of power. Who has the authority to decide how history is remembered, what cultural values are prioritized, and how that plays out in our daily lives?
You've hit the nail on the head, and in the case of Takanini, it seems like the answer to that question is still being debated.
It feels like with this Takanini name change, we've uncovered something much bigger than just a spelling debate. It's this real clash between those pushing for the so-called historically accurate spelling and those who see it as more about politics than history. It makes you wonder where this leaves the people who actually live in Takanini, you know?
Yeah, it's got to be tough being caught in the middle of this whole thing. Imagine feeling like your neighborhood is turning into this battleground for all these big cultural and political debates.
Absolutely. One of the sources we looked at even talked about this idea of a retreatist group forming within society, like people who just refuse to adopt the new spellings and pronunciations. Do you think that's a real possibility, or is that just like an exaggeration?
I think it's a real thing, and not just in New Zealand either. It seems like whenever you have these big cultural shifts, you're always going to have some people who resist them. Maybe they're just nostalgic for the old ways, or maybe they feel like their culture is being eroded. But whatever the reason, these retreatists, as they call them, they represent a whole segment of the population that feels increasingly out of touch with the mainstream.
It makes you wonder if pushing for these changes could actually backfire in a way. Like instead of bringing people together, it ends up pushing them further apart.
That's a valid concern, and it shows just how important it is to have these open and honest conversations about these issues. If people feel like their concerns are being dismissed or like these changes are being forced on them, well, it's only natural that they're going to resist.
And we can't forget about the social pressure, too. Sometimes it feels like there's this expectation that you have to conform to the new norms, or else you'll be ridiculed or even ostracized. I remember that example from our research, the one with the radio host Marcus Lush. He totally went off on this woman on air just because she mispronounced the name of her own town.
Why are you so threatened by this?
I just think that it is so wrong that people can try and tell an 83-year-old person where she came from. She grew up in Opaho.
I'm telling her how it's pronounced.
It's not pronounced. Who's telling an 83-year-old person how Opaho is pronounced? She grew up there. She was born and bred there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God, this call almost should go to Te Papa.
Yeah, I tell you what.
To highlight someone that is just so willfully.
We don't speak like that down here, and
so you are deliberately misrepresenting a language.
It was brutal.
Yeah, that was pretty rough. And it just goes to show how these debates about language can get really personal and even cruel. When people feel like they can't even speak their mind without being attacked, it creates this stifling environment where free expression goes out the window.
So we started off talking about a suburb's name, and now we're talking about power, identity, and the whole nature of cultural change. It's been quite a journey.
These deep dives, they always seem to lead to unexpected places. And in this case, it's taken us to the heart of some pretty fundamental questions about how societies navigate periods of transition. How do we honor the past while still adapting to the present? How do we balance different cultural perspectives without tearing each other apart?
Those are big questions. Is there even a way to bridge these divides, to find some kind of common ground?
It's tough, that's for sure. But I think the first step is to acknowledge that there are valid points on both sides of this debate. You know, the people who are pushing for these name changes, they often have good intentions. They want to right historical wrongs and give a voice to those who have been marginalized. And the people who resist these changes, they often have legitimate concerns too. They're worried about losing their heritage, their sense of belonging. We need to recognize that both sides have something valuable to say.
So how do we move forward in a way that respects those different perspectives without creating even more division?
Well, it's not an easy answer, but I think it starts with dialogue, with empathy, with a willingness to listen to each other. Maybe instead of trying to impose one correct version of history or language, we should focus on creating a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of the past. An understanding that recognizes the contributions and experiences of all New Zealanders.
I think that's a great point to end on. This deep dive into Takanini has really been an eye-opener. What started as a simple question about a name turned into this exploration of cultural identity, power dynamics, and the challenges of navigating change in a diverse society. We covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I think the most important takeaway is that these debates, at their core, they're about people. Their stories, their sense of belonging, and their hopes for the future. We can't lose sight of that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of the Takanini name change debate. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. And if you're ever in Auckland, make sure to take a trip out to Takanini. See for yourself how this little suburb embodies the complexities of New Zealand's past, present, and future.